The FinCEN files highlight about $2 trillion of global money flows over nearly 2 decades. The information was leaked from more than 2,100 suspicious activity reports, or SARs, that banks filed with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is under the U.S. Treasury Department. The Suspicious Transaction Report, or STR, is a similar report filed with Singapore authorities.
This problem underpins drug dealing, terrorism, and all vast amounts of criminality around the world. It is the cushion upon which many people lose their savings, people lose their lives, people lose hope because they've been defrauded, or because they've been the victim of a terrorist attack, or because they have been a victim of a myriad other crimes. At the root of all criminality is money. It's where it begins and where it ends. And in the middle are the banks.
While these reports are not definitive proof of wrongdoing or crime, they document a bank's suspicion that a client may be engaged in criminal activity.
In most jurisdictions, it is a legal obligation to file the STRs. When you file an STR, you will have a safe harbor from being prosecuted for money laundering. The threshold for reporting or filing is deliberately a low one whenever there's suspicion of something untoward.
Because of the low threshold, STRs will be filed for a range of transactions. Some of these are actually legitimate flows, while some of these aren't. It's then up to the banks to look into them.
They may file a suspicious transaction report, right? That may be scenario one. And at that point, they are required usually to do something called enhanced due diligence. So they are supposed to try and find out more. And they also have an ongoing monitoring requirement. So if information comes up along the way, they are supposed to reassess their client relationship. And if they think there is actually something that is more than just suspicious, in theory they should terminate the relationships. Otherwise, they could be found to be actively facilitating money laundering.
So with multiple layers of checks and balances, why are there still compliance lapses? Sometimes it's just not so easy to trace where the money is coming from.
They are sometimes not even dealing with their clients and they're getting money from somewhere else. Right? And in the case of correspondent banks, it's even more complicated because correspondent banks are essentially intermediary banks which receive money from another bank on behalf of someone. Right? For example, a US correspondent bank operating in Myanmar may be getting banks from a Myanmar bank, getting money from a Myanmar bank and then transferring it to another US bank, which will then go into another US account.
The criminal could also be hiding behind different entities to escape detection.
The terrorists will be hiding behind some other nominee or proxy, and there will be some other offshore entity that is involved. And then banks are supposed to know who the beneficial owner are. But I think the question is whether the banks kind of work hard enough. Sometimes the problem we have seen is that the wealthier the clients, the more money there is to be made, and the bigger the dollar amount, the easier it seems to be for transactions to go through.
It gets more challenging when banks have branches overseas in markets where the regulations are not as stringent.
The problem actually happens in a far-flung subsidiary like HSBC had a problem with the Mexican subsidiaries that were having transactions with drug cartels, for example. And then Deutsche had some problem with their UK trading desk and doing business with, say, the Russian side, for example. And many of these banks also, the problem is they never integrate. So when they have those subsidiaries out there, their know your customer money laundering controls may not be at the same standard.
The FinCEN files show that 5 of the banks had been fined before for failing to stem flows of dirty money. They are JP Morgan Chase, HSBC, Standard Chartered Bank, Deutsche Bank, and Bank of New York Mellon.
It's not something that happens occasionally, but it's often. And it involves not smaller banks, but the biggest banks in the world. And it involves not just the biggest banks, but the biggest banks that have previously been fined heavily for this, they continue to move dirty money, and they're not doing so in small amounts. They're doing so in vast amounts, amounts that are unimaginable to most of us, billions and billions of dollars.
Kroll's Kwek Chin Yong says there are measures to ensure banks improve on their internal controls after they have been fined.
Whenever a bank gets fined under the current regime, they will usually be placed on monitoring regimes. So, for example, when you get fined, let's say a few $100 million, thereafter the banks are supposed to come up with an enhanced monitoring regime, and an independent monitor will go in and review the transactions to make sure that, generally speaking, their checks and controls are better.
But corporate governance experts say that the bigger problem lies with the corporate culture.
A lot of these cases you see at the end is basically very strong emphasis on sales and profits at the top of the organization, which is really the tone set by the board and senior management, right? And when you don't have the right corporate culture, it doesn't matter what kind of compliance or internal controls you have, because you'll be overridden.
I think there is a strong case or strong argument for personal accountability of senior management who fail to set the right tone at the top and set the right culture for the bank and set the right values and the right reward system. And whenever there's a breach of personal accountability, I think there is a stronger argument for criminal and civil liability at the personal level.
The main reason why, especially the United States, likes to do this is that they don't want to fully prosecute a company and put the company out of business, because employees would suffer. Of course, we can do more. In an extreme example, not allow banks to operate at all, and there'll be no money laundering. But commercial realities make that difficult. So they always call it the regulatory pendulum. How far do you want to swing? Do you want to make it very difficult for this to take place, but at the cost of expediency of business?